Let me tell you about Emily Chambers and the day the universe decided to really commit to the bit. It started, as most of Emily's disasters did, before 8 in the morning. The espresso machine, a temperamental Italian beast she'd named Gianni after her most unreliable ex-boyfriend, had developed a new leak. Not a dramatic throw-your-hands-up-and-call-a-plumber leak. No, that would have been too merciful, too clean. This was a slow, petty, personal drip that landed with pinpoint accuracy on the electrical strip beneath the counter, which meant Emily had spent the first 40 minutes of her Tuesday crouched on the floor of the Battered Page with a roll of paper towels, a strip of electrical tape she was fairly certain was older than her business license, and a running internal monologue that would have made a sailor uncomfortable. "It's fine," she told herself, which was a lie. And she knew it, and the universe knew it, and the universe found it adorable that she kept trying. The Battered Page was Emily's bookstore cafe, and it sat on the corner of Maple and 2nd in Tucker Creek, Missouri, like it had always been there and always intended to be. Which was more or less true. The building was old, all warm brick and slightly uneven floors and windows that required a specific technique to open, a firm push-up, a quarter turn of the latch, and a prayer to whatever saint handled residential architecture. Emily had inherited the lease from her grandmother, along with a collection of first editions that were more sentimental than valuable, a cast-iron bread pan that weighed approximately as much as a golden retriever, and the unshakable conviction that a good bookstore should also have good coffee, because readers deserved both vices in one location. She'd painted the door the color of old claret. She'd found mismatched armchairs at every estate sale within 40 miles. She'd built the cafe counter herself. Well, she'd mostly built it herself, and Seth had finished it without making her feel bad about the parts that weren't quite level, which was its own kind of gift. The store smelled like coffee and paper, and something warm that Emily had never been able to identify, but that her customers always mentioned when they walked in. She loved it, with the specific, complicated love you reserve for things that are constantly trying to kill you. Speaking of which, Gianni dripped again, directly onto her wrist. "You absolute!" The bell above the front door chimed. Emily straightened up from behind the counter so fast she clipped her head on the underside of the espresso machine, swore again, pressed her lips together, and arranged her face into something that hopefully read as welcoming small business owner rather than woman one drip away from arson. It was Seth. Of course it was Seth. Seth O'Conner had an unerring instinct for showing up at her lowest moments, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in the way a load-bearing wall feels. You don't think about it until you notice how much weight it's quietly holding. He filled the doorframe the way he always did, which was to say completely, because Seth was built like someone had designed him for actual use. Not pretty, not polished. Solid. Wide shoulders under a gray Henley with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, jeans with a real work not fashion choice streak of something across the thigh, boots that had seen weather. His hair was dark and cut short, his jaw was strong, and his eyes were the specific warm brown of coffee about 30 seconds before it's perfect. He had sawdust on his left forearm and was carrying, without being asked, a fresh roll of paper towels. He looked at her. He looked at the paper towels already deployed on the floor. He looked at the guilty tilt of Gianni's drip nozzle. "Gianni again?" "Gianni again," Emily confirmed. "I think he does it on purpose. I think he plans it." Seth crossed to the counter, dropped the fresh roll next to her, crouched down, and peered under the machine with the focused, unhurried expression of a man who was constitutionally incapable of looking at a broken thing and walking away from it. Emily had always found this quality either deeply comforting or deeply irritating, depending on whether the broken thing was an appliance or an argument. "Hand me that tape." She handed him the tape. He was quiet for a moment, working. Emily leaned against the counter above him and looked at the tin ceiling she'd refinished herself and thought, not for the first time, that she should probably learn how to fix things. She was 31 years old. She had a business degree and strong opinions about narrative structure, and she could make a cortado that would make you briefly religious, but she could not fix a drip valve to save her life. There, Seth stood. And here was the thing about Seth standing up from under the counter. There was nowhere for him to go but up. And up meant close, because the space behind the counter was not designed with two adults in mind. So he rose, and he was right there, close enough that Emily could see the particular way his jaw worked when he was deciding whether to say something, close enough to smell cedar and something darker underneath, close enough that she was suddenly very aware of her own hands and what to do with them. She became intensely interested in a fixed point approximately 4 inches above his left shoulder. "Thanks," she said, and her voice came out completely normal, which she considered a personal victory. He stepped back, giving her room, like he hadn't noticed anything. He probably hadn't. Seth was annoyingly oblivious to the effect of his own proximity, which Emily found both a relief and, if she was being honest with herself, which she tried very hard not to be, a little bit disappointing. You need a new seal on that valve. I've got one next door. I'll swap it out tonight. You don't have to. I know. He was already moving toward the door, already reaching for the handle. He paused, because he always paused, because Seth O'Conner had an irritating gift for the parting shot. Nice scones, by the way. Emily looked at the oven. A thin ribbon of gray smoke was curling from the seal. Oh, come on! Seth's laugh was low and brief and warm, and the bell above the door chimed as he left, and Emily grabbed her oven mitts and tried not to smile. The universe, she thought, was a smug little creature, but some days it at least had the decency to send backup. Tucker Creek was the kind of Missouri town that had survived the 20th century with its bones mostly intact, which was more than could be said for a lot of places. Main Street still had a hardware store, and a diner, and a barber shop, and a library that smelled the way libraries are supposed to smell. The population ran around 4,000, which meant everybody knew your business approximately 48 hours before you did, and the phrase I heard was both the town's primary news delivery system and its favorite social weapon. Emily had grown up here. She'd left for college, University of Missouri, English lit, 4 years of reading things she loved and arguing about them with people who also loved them. And she'd come back, which Tucker Creek viewed as a personal compliment, and which Emily's college roommate viewed as a form of self-sabotage. They were both a little bit right. She'd come back for her grandmother, initially, and then her grandmother had died and left her the lease and the bread pan in the first editions, and Emily had found herself standing in the empty storefront on the corner of Maple and 2nd, and something in her chest had said here in a voice too quiet to argue with. That had been 4 years ago. She'd painted the door herself. She'd built most of the counter herself. She'd opened the Battered Page on a Tuesday in March during a sleet storm, with 17 customers, 1 working outlet, and exactly the kind of inauspicious beginning that the universe apparently considered her brand. The store had survived. More than survived, actually. It had become the kind of place people sought out, a destination rather than a convenience, which was the best thing a small bookstore could be in an era that had decided physical books were a charming anachronism. Emily was ferociously proud of this and refused to say so directly, because that felt like tempting fate, and fate had already demonstrated its feelings about her. Seth's hardware store, O'Connor's, had been on Maple Street since his grandfather opened it, which meant it predated the Battered Page by about 60 years and had the kind of established authority Emily deeply envied. Seth had taken it over from his father 7 years ago, kept everything that worked, quietly modernized what didn't, and ran the place with a calm efficiency that made it look effortless. Emily knew it wasn't effortless. She'd watched him work. Nothing Seth did was effortless. It was all just practiced enough to look that way. They'd been friends since the 4th grade, when Seth had wordlessly given Emily half his lunch after she'd dropped hers in a puddle, and she had wordlessly accepted it, and neither of them had made a thing of it. That was the template for their entire friendship, really. Wordless assistance. No fuss. No production. Just showing up. She didn't think about it too hard. When she started thinking about Seth O'Conner too hard, she ended up noticing his forearms again, and that was a door she kept firmly, sensibly closed. The bird hit her anniversary sign on Wednesday. Emily was standing outside with a cup of coffee, looking at the chalk sandwich board she'd spent 45 minutes on, the Battered Page, 4 years of highly caffeinated literature. With a little drawing of a coffee cup and a book that she was objectively proud of, when a grackle made a single, decisive pass overhead and rendered the whole thing a biohazard. She stood there for a moment. She took a sip of her coffee. 4 years, she said to no one in particular. 4 years, and this is the cake. Could have been worse. Seth's voice came from the doorway of O'Connor's, where he was leaning in that particular way of his, shoulder against the frame, arms loosely crossed, the physical embodiment of a man who had nowhere to be and all day to get there. How? Emily said flatly. Could this possibly be worse? He considered this with apparent sincerity. Could have been a bigger bird. Emily looked at him. He looked back at her with that straight-faced expression that she knew, after 22 years, meant he was killing himself internally. She pointed at him. That's not helpful. No, he agreed, but it's accurate. He disappeared inside and came back with a clean rag and a bottle of what appeared to be window cleaner, which he handed to her without ceremony, and then he went back inside without another word. Emily stared at the rag, then at her ruined sign, then at the door where Seth had been. The universe giveth, she thought, and the universe taketh away. And occasionally the universe sent a large man with cleaning supplies and a talent for dry delivery, and honestly that was the best the arrangement was going to get. She cleaned her sign, she redrew the coffee cup, she went inside and made a fresh batch of scones. By 10 o'clock, she had a line. See? She thought. Fine. Everything is fine. She should have knocked on something wooden. She should have known better than to think the word fine before noon. He came in on Thursday. Emily was reorganizing the fiction wall. She did this seasonally and with the focused intensity of someone rearranging the tiles of the universe into a better order. When the bell chimed and she heard, rather than saw, the entrance of someone who moved differently than Tucker Creek usually moved. There was a quality to it, an expectation of space. She turned around. The man standing just inside her door was, she would acknowledge, objectively attractive in the way that certain expensive things are attractive. All clean lines and confident proportion, the kind of handsome that came with money or very good genetics, or, in this case, apparently both. Dark hair, well cut. A suit that fit him the way suits fit men who have suits made for them. A smile that arrived on his face like it owned the property. He looked around the battered page the way people look at things they're considering buying. Emily set down the book in her hand. Welcome to the battered page. She kept her voice the specific, warm but professional temperature of a woman who had worked retail long enough to smile at anything. Can I help you find something? He looked at her then, and the smile recalibrated. Less surveying, more personal, which Emily clocked and filed and did not react to. Mark Hathaway. He crossed to the counter with a hand extended, like this was a business meeting he'd called. I've been meaning to stop in. Emily Chambers. She shook his hand because refusing to would have been childish, even if something in her chest registered the grip. Confident, held a fraction too long. We're glad to have you. Are you a reader, Mr. Hathaway? Or... Mark, please. The smile again. It was a good smile. She distrusted it thoroughly. Both, depending on what's on the table. He glanced around the store again. Charming place. Really. It suits the block. Thanks. We like it. I was actually hoping to talk to you about this block, as a matter of fact. He leaned against her counter with the ease of someone who leaned on things he considered his. There are some exciting changes coming to this part of Tucker Creek. I think you'll find them very interesting. Emily looked at him. The word changes had the texture of a threat dressed up for company. She'd been running a small business for 4 years. She developed a finely tuned sensor for sentences that sounded positive and weren't. Changes, she repeated pleasantly. Development. Revitalization. The word the city council likes is investment. His eyes did that surveying thing again, moving across her shelves, her ceiling, her worn and beloved floors. Tucker Creek has a lot of potential that hasn't been fully realized. I always thought it was fully realized, Emily said. It's a town. It realizes itself every day. That's sort of the nature of towns. He laughed. It was a good laugh. She'd give him that, genuine sounding, if you didn't notice how quickly his eyes stayed calculating while his mouth was entertained. I like you, he said, like this was a significant conferral. Fantastic, Emily said. Can I get you a coffee? He ordered a black coffee and browsed her shelves for 20 minutes with the energy of a man who was actually casing a location, and when he left a business card on her counter. Heavy stock embossed lettering. Hathaway Development Group. Emily held it for a moment. Then she put it in the small ceramic bowl on her counter, where she kept things she didn't know what to do with yet. She didn't throw it away. She would examine, later, why she didn't throw it away. Quick request. If you find yourself enjoying the narrative, please hit that like button. It really helps me know that I have hit the mark with these stories. If you would like to leave a location suggestion for future stories, drop it in the comments. He came back on Friday morning because the universe has a sense of continuity. And Seth was there, because Seth came every morning now for coffee, which he claimed was about the quality of the espresso and which Emily chose not to examine further. He was at the counter with his hands wrapped around a mug, talking to her about the lumber delivery he was expecting, and then the bell chimed and he glanced at the door and something changed in his face. Not much. Seth's face didn't do much. It was one of his most irritating features, the economy of his expression. But something in his jaw shifted. Something around his eyes went still and assessing, and Emily turned to see Mark Hathaway in her doorway for the second time. His good suit, and his good smile, and his hand already raised in greeting. Emily. He said her name like they were old friends, which they were not. His gaze moved to Seth with the particular calibration of a man reading a room. Sorry, am I interrupting? "Just coffee," Emily said. "Just coffee." Mark agreed and smiled at Seth with the specific warmth of a man who is not remotely warm towards Seth. Mark Hathaway, Seth O'Conner. Seth didn't extend his hand, he picked up his mug. It wasn't rude, exactly. It was just very clear. Mark ordered his coffee, told Emily another half story about the very exciting changes coming to Tucker Creek, and left. The bell chimed. Silence settled. "What's his deal?" Emily asked. Seth set his mug down. "Hathaway Development, he's been circling Tucker Creek for 2 years, bought up 3 properties on the east side of town last year." Emily looked at the door. "He said he wanted to talk about this block." Seth looked at her. It was the kind of look that said, "Yes, I know, I've already thought about this, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to alarm you, and now I'm wondering if I made the wrong call." It was a very efficient look. "I'll ask around," he said. "You don't—" "I know." He was already picking up his jacket. That night, he came back to replace Gianni's valve seal, as promised. He did it efficiently and without fanfare, and when he was done he wiped down the counter, and Emily made them both coffee with the now functional machine, and they sat in the mismatched armchairs by the window and talked about nothing important until almost 10 o'clock. When he left, he stood at her door for a moment, that pause of his, that characteristic beat, and then he said, "Lock up right after me." "I always lock up, I know." He held her gaze for 1 second longer than strictly necessary. "Lock up right after me." Emily locked up right after him. She stood in the middle of her quiet, beautiful, slightly broken store and thought about Seth O'Connor's warm brown eyes, and decided firmly that she was not going to think about Seth O'Connor's warm brown eyes. She was, as previously established, not great at decisions. The town meeting was on Tuesday, and Emily went because she always went, because small-town civic participation was a value her grandmother had installed in her, alongside the bread pan and the opinions about narrative structure. She sat in the 3rd row of the Tucker Creek Community Center, with Dolores Marsh on her left. Dolores was 73, 4'11", and had the intel network of a small intelligence agency and a cup of gas station coffee on her right, because the community center's coffee maker had been broken since the Obama administration. The meeting covered the usual. Road resurfacing on Pine. The zoning dispute about the Henley Barn. The library's request for a new HVAC system, which Councilman Briggs was making complicated in ways that suggested he had a personal grievance with temperature regulation. And then Gerald Potts, who handled commercial property assessment for Tucker Creek, shuffled some papers and said, in the way that Gerald said everything, slowly, with the enthusiasm of a man reading a telephone directory, that the council wanted to acknowledge the finalization of a recent commercial property transaction on the Maple Street corridor. Emily drank her bad coffee. The block, comprising 14 through 22 Maple Street, has been purchased by Hathaway Development Group, effective. Emily's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth, with all existing lease agreements to be honored through their current terms, at which point 14 through 22 Maple Street. The Battered Page was at 18 Maple Street. The room had gone slightly soft around the edges, the way rooms do when your blood pressure does something abrupt. Emily was distantly aware of Dolores Marsh saying something sharp beside her. She was more immediately aware that Mark Hathaway was sitting in the back row. She could see him now. How had she not seen him? In his good suit, and when her head turned toward him, he met her gaze and smiled. It was the most expensive smile she had ever hated. She set her coffee down on the chair beside her because she needed her hands to be free, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, but that felt important. The meeting continued around her like weather. She found out afterward, from Dolores, who found out everything, that the sale had finalized 3 weeks ago, that it had been done quietly, that Mark Hathaway had made a point of visiting the Battered Page before Emily knew who he was, which meant he'd stood in her store and smiled at her shelves with full knowledge that he owned the building under her feet. She was not a woman given to extended dramatic reaction. The universe had trained her out of it, preferring instead a steady drip of indignity to single catastrophic blows. But standing on the sidewalk outside the Tucker Creek Community Center at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, she was briefly, completely furious, in the clean, incandescent way that only genuine betrayal produces. Seth found her there. She didn't know how. She hadn't texted him, hadn't called, but there he was, coming around the corner from the direction of Maple Street. which meant he'd probably heard at the hardware store because Tucker Creek moved information at the speed of sound when the information was sufficiently interesting. He stopped in front of her, looked at her face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I heard." "He was in my store," Emily said. The fury was very clean. Very specific. "He stood in my store and looked at my shelves, and he already owned the building. She stopped because the sentence didn't have an ending that didn't make her sound either furious or frightened, and she refused to sound frightened. "What does he want, Seth?" Seth's jaw did that thing it did. "I don't know yet. Best guess." He looked down the street toward Maple, and his expression had gone to the specific quiet that meant he was thinking things he wasn't ready to say. "Best guess he wants the block. Full redevelopment. Which means eventually he wants you out." Out. The word landed in her sternum like a small, cold stone. "Okay," she said. Because what else was there? The universe. Consistent as always. "Okay," Seth reached out. His hand found her shoulder. Just that. Just his hand, warm and steady on her shoulder. And then he shrugged off his jacket and settled it around her without asking. Because she was cold, and he'd noticed before she had. Because that was simply what Seth did. "Come on," he said. "I'll walk you to your car." She wore his jacket for 3 blocks. She walked with her hands in its pockets, which were deep and smelled like cedar and Seth, and she didn't give it back when they reached her car. She folded it over her arm and got in and drove home, and only when she was inside her apartment did she sit down on her couch and hold his jacket in her lap and allow herself, for approximately 4 minutes, to feel everything she'd been holding at arm's length since the community center. Then she put the jacket over the back of her chair, made herself tea, and went back to being fine. She was very good at going back to being fine. It was one of her worst habits. The next morning, Mark Hathaway walked into the Battered Page, ordered his coffee with the ease of a man who'd been a regular for years, and waited until there were no other customers before he said, pleasantly, "I'd love to take you to dinner, Emily. Thursday, maybe. We could discuss your lease terms." Emily poured his coffee. She set the cup on the counter. She looked at him with the specific warm expression she'd developed for managing situations she'd rather set on fire. "Mr. Hathaway," she said, "I appreciate the invitation. The answer is no." "It's Mark," he smiled. "And the answer to what, exactly? I haven't made an offer yet." "Whatever the offer is," Emily said, "the answer is no." He picked up his coffee. He was still smiling, but the smile had done something subtle. Shed a layer, gotten thinner. "You know, your lease comes up for renewal in 8 months. It would be nice to have a conversation before then." 8 months is a long time," Emily said pleasantly. "So much could happen." He held her gaze for a beat longer than comfortable. "It really could." He agreed, and his voice was perfectly pleasant, and somehow that was the worst part. He left. The bell chimed. Emily stood behind her counter and breathed and thought about what it meant that Mark Hathaway's pleasantness made her feel the way a falling barometer made old farmers feel, like something was coming. She picked up her phone. She started to text Seth. She put the phone down. She picked it up again. He just made a dinner offer. Tied to lease renewal. I turned him down. Seth's reply came in under a minute. "Okay. I'm next door." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. That was the thing about Seth. It was the shelves that did it, if Emily was being honest. And she was, in retrospect, with the particular honesty available only after the fact, when the pretending is no longer useful. It was Thursday night, 5 days after the town meeting, and Seth had come over to help her reinforce the new shelving unit she'd built for the rear wall of the store. This was not an intimate activity. This was a practical, logistical activity involving a drill and a level, and the specific architectural comedy of Emily holding one end of a shelf while Seth adjusted the bracket on the other end, and both of them being 4 degrees too far apart to make it work. "Come here," Seth said. Not an invitation, an instruction. The kind of low, direct tone he used when he knew what needed to happen. Emily moved to where he indicated, and suddenly she was in the corner where the shelving met the wall, and Seth was reaching past her to adjust the upper bracket, which required his arm to come across her and his body to be closer than a shelf installation required, objectively. He reached, he adjusted, he did not move back. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could see the line of his jaw from this angle, could note with some medical concern that her own pulse had done something inadvisable. The shelf was level. There was no remaining practical reason for his proximity. He looked down at her. Emily Chambers was a woman of reasonable intelligence and considerable stubbornness, and she had maintained the fiction of just friends for 22 years through sheer determined willfulness. But there was a limit to willfulness. There was a point at which the door marked "Do Not Open" develops a certain inevitability. "Seth," she said, which was not a question, but it landed between them like one. "Yeah," he said, which was not an answer, but it landed like one. Later, she would not be able to say who moved. She suspected it was both of them, and that the shelf had something to do with it, and that 22 years of accumulated proximity had simply reached its conclusion. His hands found her face, both of them, cupped, careful, like she was something he decided about, and he kissed her. It was not a small kiss. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't start tentative, because neither person in it is tentative, because this was not a new thing, it was a recognized thing, a thing that had been waiting with the patience that only long friendship produces. It was warm and certain and unhurried, and his hand slid from her face to her waist and pulled her in, and Emily Chambers, who was afraid of very little and pretended to be afraid of nothing, grabbed the front of his flannel shirt with both hands and kissed him back with 4 years of pretending compressed into a single honest moment. When they finally stopped, and stopping was its own act of will, Seth pressed his forehead to hers. His hands were at her waist, thumbs resting against her hip bones. She could feel him breathing. "Well?" Emily said. "Yeah," Seth said. "That was, yeah." She looked up at him, he looked down at her. Something in his expression was very different from the Seth she'd been looking at for 22 years. Not unrecognizable, not foreign, but revealed, like a page turned. "The shelf is level," Emily said, Seth's mouth curved. It was not his usual economical, almost smile. It was a real one, and it transformed him, and she felt the transformation in her chest like a match struck. "The shelf is level," he agreed. They finished the shelving unit. It took considerably longer than it should have, for reasons the shelf did not need to know about. Emily Chambers, it turned out, was terrible at slow. She'd always known this about herself in theory. She'd built a business at 31, she'd hauled her grandmother's armchairs across 2 counties. She was the kind of person who finished other people's sentences, not to be rude, but because her brain was genuinely 3 steps ahead of the room. Slow was not her register. So when the thing that had been building between her and Seth for 22 years started moving, it did not move slowly. It moved the way a river moves when you've been holding back a dam, with absolute, unhurried, geological certainty. Friday was different. She felt it from the moment he came in for his morning coffee, his eyes finding her first before anything else in the room, the specific quality of his attention, the fact that he stayed an extra hour, ostensibly rereading the paperback he'd brought from next door, actually watching her move around her store with the particular focus of a man who had made a decision. She felt it in her fingertips when she set his refill down and their hands briefly overlapped on the mug. By Friday afternoon, the store was closed and they were in the back room. Emily's combination office and storage and personal chaos management center, and Seth was fixing the wobble in her desk again, because it had been wobbling for 6 months, and he'd apparently decided today was the day, and Emily was sitting on the counter pretending to review her inventory spreadsheet and actually watching him work. She said his name. He looked up from under the desk. "Come here," she said. Seth O'Conner was not a man given to indecision. He stood up, and he crossed the room, and he stopped in front of where she sat on the counter, and looked at her with those warm brown eyes that she'd been studiously not looking at for years. She put her hands on his shoulders and pulled him in. Here's the thing about Seth O'Conner that Emily hadn't known, couldn't have known, from the outside of it. He was as unhurried in this as he was in everything else. While Emily's entire mode was compressed and efficient and just get to the point, Seth moved through the world like a man who understood that the best things required the time they required, and not a moment less. He kissed her like he had the rest of the night. Both hands in her hair, not rushing, not pressing past what the moment was, just entirely, devastatingly present. It was, Emily thought, the most infuriating and perfect thing that had ever happened to her. He carried her home. That was how she'd remember it, even though the literal mechanics were that they walked the 4 blocks to her apartment, above the hardware supply annex where she'd rented since year 2 of the business, and Seth carried only her bag, which he'd picked up off the counter without comment, and held while she locked the store. But it felt like being carried. The way he walked beside her with his hand at the small of her back, the way he opened the building door and gestured her through, the way he held her keys while she was looking for them in her bag and handed them back without making it a thing. Inside her apartment, he set her bag on her kitchen chair. He looked around her place with the unhurried curiosity of someone seeing something familiar in a new way. She watched him look at her bookshelves, floor to ceiling, organized in a system that made sense to her and absolutely no one else, and at the bread pan on her counter that had been her grandmother's, and at the framed print above her reading chair that was from a book she'd loved when she was 12 and had never been able to articulate why. "I always liked this place," he said. "You've been here 100 times." "I know." He turned to look at her. "I always liked it." Emily Chambers had a few defenses left. She used none of them. This is the part of the story, fair warning, where the campfire gets a little warmer. Pour yourself something if you haven't already. He kissed her in the kitchen doorway, unhurried as always, one hand braced on the frame above her head and one at her jaw, tilting her face up toward him. She could feel the warmth of his hand against her cheek, the light rasp of his palm, and underneath the cedar scent of him, there was something else, warmer, deeper, the particular heat of a person when they've made up their mind. She slid her hands under his shirt and felt him breathe in, felt his stomach tighten under her palms, felt the shift in his kiss from unhurried to something with more intention behind it. Emily. Just her name, just that. The way he'd said it against the bookshelf, low and direct, except now there was nowhere to be indirect about what it meant. "Yeah," she said against his mouth. "Yeah." He walked her backward through the apartment with the focused, deliberate certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was going to do it properly. Not rushed, decided. There was a difference, and she felt it in every point of contact. His hands moving over her with the same careful attention he gave to everything he did, learning the shape of her with his palms and his fingertips, like he was memorizing something he intended to keep. When they reached the bedroom, he reached past her to turn on the bedside lamp, which gave the room a warm, low light, and then he stood in front of her and looked at her. Just looked. The way he'd looked at her bookshelves, like he was taking inventory of something he planned to know well, and Emily, who was not easily undone, felt undone. She reached for his shirt. He let her pull it off over his head, and then he reached for hers, unhurried, his knuckles grazing her ribs as he lifted the fabric away, and the contact of his warm hands against her bare skin was enough to make her breath catch audibly in the quiet room. "You're cold," he said, and pulled her against him, and She'd been cold, without knowing it, and he was warm the way solid things are warm, and she pressed into the heat of his chest and felt his arms come around her and thought, oh, like a door opening, like something clicking into its right position for the first time. He eased her back onto the bed and came down over her, careful and deliberate, and she pulled him down until his weight settled against her, real and substantial and absolutely welcome, and his mouth found the curve of her neck, the line of her shoulder, the soft place below her ear. She arched up into him and heard the low sound in his chest and felt an answering heat uncoil through her entire body. She said his name. He said hers. Outside, Tucker Creek was quiet and dark, and in Emily's bedroom the lamp threw its warm light across them both, and Seth O'Conner was thorough and gentle and absolutely sure of himself, in a way that she found simultaneously infuriating and perfect, and Emily Chambers gave up the last of her defenses and let herself have this. Let herself have him. He was unhurried until he wasn't, until she dismantled the patience of him with her hands and her voice and the arch of her body against his. And then he was something else entirely, something she hadn't anticipated, focused and warm and present in a way that felt like being genuinely known. Every part of him against every part of her, no space between them, no armor, no pretending. Afterward, she lay against his chest and listened to his heart slow, and his hand moved slowly up and down her spine, and the lamp made everything amber and warm. "Seth?" she said, after a while. The desk wobble. She felt his chest move with the suppressed laugh. "You didn't actually fix it." "I'll fix it tomorrow," he said, without any particular concern. And she laughed into his shoulder, and he held her tighter, and that was that. Saturday morning arrived the way Saturday mornings do in Tucker Creek. Gradually, with birds and the distant sound of someone's truck and the quality of light through thin curtains that said, "No hurry." Emily woke up and for approximately 3 seconds existed in the pure, uncomplicated warmth of someone who has slept well beside someone her eyes opened. "Oh," said her brain, shifting into first gear. "Oh, we did do that. That was a thing we did. That was Seth. That is Seth's arm." Seth's arm was, in fact, across her waist, and Seth was awake. She could tell from the quality of his stillness, the awake stillness rather than the asleep stillness, which she somehow already knew the difference between, which was information. She stared at the ceiling and began constructing the internal monologue. The what does this mean? And the what do we do now? And the what if this breaks 22 years of The smell of coffee hit her. She turned her head. Seth was already on his elbow, watching her, and he was holding a mug that he'd clearly gotten up to make at some point, because there it was, steaming. Her specific mug from her cabinet, the big one with the chipped handle that was her favorite, extended toward her. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "You found my coffee," she said. "Wasn't hard." He kept the mug extended, waiting. She took it. She sat up. She drank. He watched her for a moment. "You were about to spiral." "I was not." She paused. "I was considering." "Emily." Quiet. Certain. Like a load-bearing wall. "I've been in love with you for about 8 years. Just so we're clear on where I am." The coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. She stared at him. He looked back at her with the particular infuriating equanimity of a man who has said the true thing and is prepared to wait for the other person to catch up. 8 years? She said. "Give or take." "Seth, you can spiral about it if you need to." He reached over and brushed the hair off her face with 2 fingers. Casual and careful. "I'll be here." Emily Chambers looked at Seth O'Conner in the morning light of her own bedroom, with her chipped coffee mug and her catastrophic bookshelves and the bread pan on the counter and all the evidence of her life arranged around them both. "The universe," she said slowly, "has not historically been this kind to me." Noted. His mouth curved. The real smile, the one she'd always registered and never let herself look at for too long. She looked at it now. "Okay," she said. Which was not "I love you," but which, for Emily, was pretty close. And from the way he looked at her, he knew exactly what it meant. She was right, incidentally, about the universe. She should have knocked on wood. For 11 days, everything was good. This was unprecedented. Emily tracked it with the quiet suspicion of a woman who had learned to distrust good luck the way you distrust a dog that's been too quiet. Something was chewing something, somewhere. You just hadn't found it yet. But for 11 days, she let herself not find it. Seth came for coffee every morning and stayed an hour, and sometimes the coffee was secondary. He fixed the desk wobble on day 3. He showed up on day 5 with lumber because she'd mentioned offhand that the step on her back entrance needed replacing, and she hadn't asked him to but had also not been surprised, because that was Seth. He put his hand on her back when they walked together, that warm, easy pressure, and opened every door like it was simply the natural order of things, and remembered that she took her tea with exactly half a spoon of honey when she had a headache, because she'd mentioned it once, months ago, and he'd stored it with everything else he kept. She was in it. She could feel herself in it, the warmth of it, the realness of it. Seth's steadiness, which she'd relied on for 22 years as a friend, was almost unbearably good in this new configuration, because it was the same quality, but pointed differently, and she was the thing it was pointed at. She slept better. She burned fewer scones. Gianni behaved himself. The universe was definitely chewing something. Day 12, it showed her what. She found the emails by accident. She'd stopped into O'Connor's to drop off a coffee. She was doing this now, bringing Seth his mid-morning coffee, which Tucker Creek had noticed and filed and discussed at length, because Tucker Creek and Seth was in the back dealing with the lumber delivery. He'd waved her in, told her to wait, and she'd sat at his ancient front counter, where he did his ordering. His laptop was open. She wasn't trying to read it. She was looking at the stapler. But her eyes moved, because eyes do. And the email thread on the screen was titled, Maple Street Block. Phase 2 Transition. And the most recent response in the thread was from Seth's email address, and it said, in 3 lines she read in about 2 seconds. "I think the timeline works. I can have the assessment done by end of month. Let me know when you want to meet." And above that, the original from mhathaway@hathawaydevelopment.com. The stapler was very still. Emily was very still. "I think the timeline works," she read it again. She was a person who understood language. It was her whole thing. Words. The weight of them. And she read those 3 lines with the cold precision of a woman whose brain had gone very quiet. "Let me know when you want to meet. Hathaway. Hathaway Development." The same email address on the business card, in her little ceramic bowl. Mark Hathaway, who owned her building, who was squeezing her lease, who had stood in her store and smiled while knowing he owned the floor under her feet. And Seth. Seth's email. Seth's words. "I can have the assessment done by end of month." An assessment. Of what? Of the block? Of her store? Of how best to transition her out of a building she'd poured 4 years and a significant percentage of her sanity into. She heard Seth's boots on the back stairs. She stood up from the stool she'd been sitting on and set down his coffee and was at the door by the time he came through from the back. "Hey," he started, "I left your coffee on the counter." Her voice was level. She was a person who could make her voice level. She'd had practice. "I have to get back." He looked at her face and something shifted in his. A quick, perceptive read, because he'd always been able to do that, hadn't he? Read her, which now felt like a different thing than it used to. "Emily, I have customers." She was already through the door. She did not have customers. She had an empty store and a back room. And she went straight there, and she sat down on the stool she kept in the corner, and she pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. Assessment done by end of month. She thought about the last 11 days. She thought about Seth showing up, Seth being there, Seth with his hands in his morning coffee and his quiet certainty. She thought about how well positioned he'd be, as her closest neighbor, as her person, to know the precise dimensions of her least vulnerability. She was being unfair. She knew, somewhere under the fury, that she was being unfair, that there were 100 explanations that weren't the worst one. But the thing about Emily Chambers and the universe was that the universe had trained her well. Paper cuts, always paper cuts, nothing dramatic, just the small and consistent evidence that the world was slightly tilted against her, and this felt, in this moment, like the truest version of that, the one that actually mattered. Seth knocked on her back door. "Emily?" Quiet. "Let me explain." She sat on her stool and breathed and did not answer. She heard him stand there for 30 seconds. A minute. She knew it was him standing, not leaving, because she knew the quality of his presence as well as she knew her own hands. Then she heard his boots on the step, moving away. She put her forehead in her hands. The universe, she thought, had been too quiet for too long. She didn't call him. He tried to call her twice, and she let it go to voicemail, and she told herself she needed time, which was true, and she told herself she wasn't ready to hear it, which was also true, and the other thing, the real thing, which she examined briefly and then put firmly in a drawer, was that she was afraid. That if she let Seth explain it, she'd believe him, because she wanted to believe him, and wanting to believe someone was the most dangerous position you could be in. She'd been there before. Not with Seth. But the architecture of it was familiar. Seth, to his credit, or to his damage, depending on how you looked at it, gave her the space she'd asked for without asking for it. He didn't push past her silence. He stopped coming for morning coffee. The light in the window between their stores was a little dimmer. Tucker Creek noticed, because Tucker Creek noticed everything, and 2 separate people asked Emily in 2 separate days if she and Seth had had a falling out, which told her exactly how visible their 11 days had been. She said they were both busy. This satisfied no one. She was alone in a way she hadn't been in a while. She tried to find it clarifying. She was not sure she succeeded. Mark Hathaway noticed too. She'd give him this. He had antennae, sharp ones. He came back into the Battered Page on a Wednesday, 8 days after Emily had gone quiet on Seth, and he came in differently this time. Less grand entrance, more routine, as if he'd been a regular for years and this was simply the next visit. He ordered his coffee, he browsed, and when the store had thinned out, he came to the counter and leaned on it in that easy way and said, "You look tired, Emily." "I'm always tired." She kept her voice level. Small business ownership is very invigorating. "It is," he agreed and smiled. "It's also stressful, especially with uncertainty hanging over you." She looked at him. "Is there uncertainty hanging over me?" "There doesn't have to be." He was very comfortable, very certain of himself. "I meant what I said about dinner, about talking. The terms of your renewal don't have to be difficult. I'd prefer they weren't." The smile adjusted slightly, not threatening but with the shadow of it underneath. "I'm a reasonable man." Emily poured herself a coffee that she didn't need and thought about how reasonable men don't have to say so. "I'll think about it," she said, because it was safer than what she actually thought. He came in Thursday and Friday, always when the store was quieter, always with the same easy confidence, the same casual remarks about the block, the same dinner invitation that lived in the subtext of every sentence without quite being said again directly. He was, she understood, applying pressure. Slowly, carefully. The way you tighten something, not all at once, because all at once is dramatic and drama is its own kind of leverage, but incrementally, so that by the time you feel the full weight of it, you've already been adjusting to it for weeks. She realized one Thursday evening, as she locked the store, being managed, and she did not have, at this particular moment, her usual backup. The absence of Seth was a specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She locked the deadbolt. She turned the sign to closed. She thought, briefly, about calling him. She picked up her phone. Put it down. This was, she would think later, the second worst decision of those 3 weeks. The worst one came on the following Tuesday. She had meant to leave early. This was the thing she'd say afterward, in the repetitive way that people replay things they cannot change. I meant to leave early. The inventory had run long. The new shipment had arrived, and she'd gotten absorbed in the unpacking, the particular pleasure of opening boxes of new books, and by the time she looked up, Tucker Creek was dark and quiet outside her windows, and the clock said 9:47. The street was empty. It was a Tuesday. Tucker Creek didn't run long on Tuesdays. O'Connor's next door was dark. Everything was dark. She was logging the last of the inventory when she heard the front bell. She'd forgotten to lock it. This was the thing. She always locked it when she flipped the sign, but she'd gotten absorbed in the shipment, and she hadn't flipped the sign, and she hadn't locked the door. "We're closed," she called from behind the rear shelves. Footsteps. Not stopping. She came around the end of the fiction wall, and Mark Hathaway was standing in the middle of her store. He wasn't wearing his good suit. He was wearing dark clothes, and his face was different. The smile was present, but the layer under it was visible now, the thing the smile had been sitting on top of for weeks, and it was not charming, and it was not polished, and it was not the reasonable man. Emily stopped. Every animal instinct she had said wrong, said it loudly, clearly, without room for her brain to negotiate or rationalize. Wrong. This is wrong. Something in the architecture of the situation was wrong, and her body knew it 4 full seconds before her mind caught up. "We're closed," she said again. Her voice came out steady. She filed this under small mercies. "I know." He moved toward her, unhurried, like a man who'd made a plan and was moving through it. "I thought we'd have a conversation that was a little more private, Emily. The store is always so busy during the day." "You need to leave." "I don't think I do." He kept coming, slow and certain, and she backed a step without meaning to, an instinctive retreat, and hated herself for it, because backing away was information, and he read it with the ease of a man who had always known exactly how much space he took up in a room. He stopped when he was close. Too close. The same counter she stood behind with customers was between them, except he was already moving around the end of it, around the edge of the counter, into her space, into the narrow working corridor that was her territory, and she was backing toward the wall. "We're past the dinner conversation," he said, conversationally, like they were discussing lease terms. "I've been very patient, very reasonable. I want you to understand that I'm not an unreasonable man. You need to leave." Her voice was lower now. "Right now. I think what I need," he said, stepping closer, "is for you to understand your situation." Her back hit the shelves behind the counter. He was close enough now that she could see the specific quality of his eyes, flat in a way they hadn't been in daylight, the charm fully abandoned, and her heart was a fist against her ribs. Every breath was deliberate. She was taking inventory of exits, the way the part of her brain that predated language was designed to. Front door is past him. Back room has a door to the alley. How far is the back room? Too far? He's between her and the back room. "There are outcomes here," he said, his voice still pleasant, still the voice he'd been using for weeks over his black coffee. "That don't have to be difficult for you. Your store can continue, your lease can be very comfortable. I can be very generous to people who are generous with me." He reached out and his fingers touched her jaw, a single, deliberate point of contact, and tilted her face up toward him. She grabbed his wrist. Not gentle, not strategic. Just the pure animal refusal that rises up when something touches you that has no right to. The bone-deep no that lives in your arms before your brain has formed the word. His face changed. The pleasantness went. What was underneath it was worse. "Emily!" His free hand came up and flattened against the shelf beside her head, boxing her in. Close now, too close. The heat of him and the smell of expensive cologne, and something underneath it that was just fear-making, in the way that proximity to unchecked power is always fear-making. "Don't be stupid about this," she was shaking. She registered this from a clinical distance, the way you register details under adrenaline, the shaking in her hands, the specific smell of the back of the store, the way the single lamp she'd left on at the counter made everything outside its circle very dark. She was shaking, and her vision had narrowed, and the thing that she called her sense of humor, her armor, the running commentary she'd maintained against every indignity the universe had handed her, it was gone. Not because she was defeated. Because this was not that kind of moment. This was the real kind. She tried to push past him. Left shoulder, push, go. He caught her arm. His grip was hard. Not hard as a warning, hard as an intention, and he pulled her back, and she stumbled. And she was back against the shelves, and he was against her, and his other hand caught her shoulder, and she opened her mouth. "Hey!" The voice came from the front of the store. Not loud. Not a shout. Just one word. Low and cold and absolutely final. In a voice she had known for 22 years, and had never, not once, heard sound like that. Mark Hathaway turned. Seth O'Conner was standing inside the front door of the Battered Page, and the door was open behind him, and the night air was coming through it, and Seth was not the biggest man in Tucker Creek, or the loudest man in Tucker Creek, or the most dramatic man in any room. But he was standing very still, and he was looking at Mark Hathaway with an expression that Emily had never seen on his face. Not fury, something past fury, something on the other side of it that fury leads to when it has completely made up its mind. It was the kind of still that was much more frightening than movement. Mark didn't move. He was calculating. She could feel it, the recalibration, the read of the room. Mark Hathaway was a man who had spent his life knowing exactly how the power in a space was distributed. He was recalculating right now. O'Conner. His voice was still even, still confident, still the reasonable man. "This is a private conversation. Is it?" Seth was already walking. Not fast, not rushed. The same deliberate, unhurried movement that characterized everything he did, except that the purpose of it now was entirely different, and the quality of it in this context, the absolute, immovable certainty of it, was one of the most frightening things Emily had ever witnessed, and she was not frightened for herself. He crossed the floor and he stopped exactly between Emily and Mark Hathaway, and he looked at Emily first. One long, comprehensive look, reading her the way he always had, cataloging every detail, and what he saw in her face made something in his jaw go tight. He turned back to Mark. "Leave," Seth said. One word. No performance. No elaboration. Mark Hathaway was, whatever else he was, a man with good animal instincts. He recognized, in this moment, a particular quality of intention that cannot be negotiated with. Not because Seth was going to make a scene. Not because Seth was going to threaten or posture, but because Seth O'Conner had clearly, quietly, and completely decided men are a different category of obstacle. "We'll continue this another time?" Mark said to Emily, over Seth's shoulder, and his voice was still smooth, but it was smooth the way ice is smooth over very cold water. He walked to the front door. He went through it. It closed behind him. The store was very quiet. Emily realized she was still pressed against the shelves. She realized her hands were shaking. She realized she'd been holding her breath for a period of time she couldn't accurately calculate, and she let it out now, all of it, and the sound it made was shaky and involuntary, and she hated it. Seth turned. He looked at her. And then he crossed the remaining distance and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his chest, and he held her with both arms, solid and warm and there, and said nothing. Just held on. She didn't cry. She wanted to note this for the record. Emily Chambers did not cry. What she did was hold on to the front of Seth O'Connor's flannel shirt with both fists and breathe until the shaking stopped, and Seth stood there for as long as it took, one hand on the back of her head, no rush, no commentary, just the immovable fact of him. "How did you?" she started. "I drive past." His voice was quiet, against the top of her head. "Every night, I drive past." She thought about that. She thought about the 11 days of silence. Seth, driving past her dark store windows every single night anyway, because that was Seth. You could shut him out, and he would give you the space and still drive past every night, because he couldn't not. "I read it wrong," she said. Her voice was muffled by his shirt. "The email, I read it wrong." "I know." He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't say "if you just listened." He said "I know" in the voice of someone who had been waiting, patiently and painfully, for this moment. "I should have let you explain." "Yeah." A pause. "You should have." She pulled back far enough to look up at him. His face in the low light of her store was the realest thing in the room. "What was it?" she asked. "The email. Property assessment for the building adjacent to the Maple Street block. O'Connor's." He held her gaze steadily. "Hathaway approached me through a third party. a development consultant I've done legitimate survey work for. I didn't know it was connected to Hathaway until after. I was documenting it for the attorney I'd already hired to look into his lease finagling. He paused. The attorney being Tom Daltrey, who you went to high school with, who has been working on this for 3 weeks. Emily stared at him. You hired a lawyer, she said. For you. Yeah, 3 weeks ago. Around there. Without telling me. You weren't speaking to me. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Seth O'Conner, who did not give his friendship or his heart easily, driving past her windows every night in the dark and hiring attorneys on her behalf in silence. Seth? She said. I'm sorry. The words were plain and direct, and she meant every syllable. I closed a door instead of opening it. He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb moved against her jaw. That gesture, the one she was already learning, the particular careful way he touched her face. You're allowed to be scared, he said. So am I. You? She stared at him. You're the least scared-looking person I've ever... Emily. Quiet. Patient. I've been in love with you for 8 years. You don't think that was frightening? She had no immediate response to this. He looked faintly satisfied by that, which she would address later. Mark Hathaway was dealt with, in the end, with the particular efficiency available to small towns that have made up their collective mind. Tom Daltrey's discovery. The thing Seth had been quietly building for 3 weeks while Emily wasn't speaking to him was a clause in Emily's original lease, inherited from her grandmother's arrangement with the previous owner, that guaranteed lease renewal rights at a fixed-rate cap through the original lessee's direct business succession. It was old language. It was solid language. It was the kind of clause that made real estate attorneys wince. It also meant that Mark Hathaway's squeeze play had a ceiling, and that ceiling was significantly lower than he'd planned for. The assault, because that was what Tom called it, professionally and without softening, and what the Tucker Creek police report called it, and what Deputy Garrison called it when he took Emily's statement the morning after, complicated things further for Mark in ways that his development portfolio could not absorb quietly in a town the size of Tucker Creek. Dolores Marsh knew within 4 hours. After Dolores knew, the information moved the way information moves in small towns. Not cruelly, not as gossip, but as the specific solidarity of a community that has decided one of its own was wronged. The Tucker Creek Business Association had opinions. The city council had concerns. The local paper, which came out on Thursdays, had a front page. Mark Hathaway left Tucker Creek with the quiet speed of a man who has accurately assessed the cost of staying. The Battered Page on the corner of Maple and 2nd remained. They were alone in the store. Actually alone, truly alone, for what felt like the first time since the world had gotten so loud. On a Thursday night 3 weeks after the night everything had happened. Emily was closing up. Seth was there because that was back to being the simple fact of him. She locked the front door, she turned off the display lights, she stood in the quiet of her store, in the warm, low lamp of it, and looked at the shelves and the armchairs and the counter she'd built with her own mostly competent hands, and felt something she rarely let herself feel. Grateful. Just grateful for the store, for the town, for the fact of standing in this room. For the man sitting in the armchair by the window reading her copy of a novel she'd recommended to him, because he always read what she recommended, because that was also just Seth. He looked up. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. He set the book down. She sat on the arm of the chair, and he made room for her the way he always made room, and his hand came to rest at her waist with the ease of something settled. Hey? She said. Hey. I've been in love with you, she said, for a really long time. I just wanted to say it out loud. Seth O'Conner looked up at her in the low light of the Battered Page, and the smile, the real one, the one she'd always registered from a careful distance, came fully onto his face. It was a devastating thing. She couldn't believe she'd been careful about it for so long. Yeah, he said. I know, she laughed. He pulled her down into the chair, which was not entirely designed for 2 people but managed, and she settled against him with his arm around her and his chin at her temple. And the store was quiet around them. Seth, she said after a while. The universe is being suspiciously nice to me. She felt him smile against her hair. Maybe it ran out of material. It never runs out of material. Then we'll deal with it when it shows up. The lamp threw its warm circle. Outside, Tucker Creek settled into the particular quiet of a small town that is, for the moment, exactly what it's supposed to be. Emily Chambers sat in the arms of the steadiest person she'd ever known, in the store she'd built and kept and fought for, and thought that maybe we'll deal with it when it shows up, was the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. Because it was a we. It was, she thought, the first time that word had felt like a load-bearing wall. 10. The grand reopening event, because Tucker Creek demanded ceremony, and Dolores Marsh had basically organized the whole thing before Emily could form an objection, was on a Saturday in late October, when the air had gone gold and the maples on Maple Street were doing their full autumnal performance. The Battered Page was packed. Standing room. Emily had made 6 dozen scones, which was 6 dozen more than she'd ever made at once, and they were gone by 11. Gianni behaved flawlessly, which she'd take as either a good omen or the setup for a spectacular failure she hadn't encountered yet. Seth was there. He was always there. But today he was there differently, as the specific presence that Tucker Creek had now officially logged and accepted, which it communicated through the time-honored small-town tradition of everyone pretending they'd known all along. Dolores Marsh said, "It's about time," to Seth's face, with the authority of a woman who considers that statement a compliment. Seth took it as one. Emily was behind the counter, refilling the pastry display, when she dropped a scone. Just one. Just a single scone, gravity being what it was, and it hit the floor and broke, and she stood there for a half-second with the thought, there it is. There's the paper cut. A hand came over the counter, Seth's hand, holding the clean cloth he always seemed to have, the one she never knew where he kept it. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her, and the corner of his mouth was already doing the thing, the almost smile, and his eyes were warm in the way that she now understood she'd been registering for 22 years and refusing to name. She took the cloth. She cleaned it up. She stood back up and found him still watching her. 1 scone, she said. Yep. The universe. Very small. Very on brand. Do you want me to? No. She set the cloth down and looked at her full store. The faces she'd known all her life. The packed shelves, the good coffee, the mismatched chairs she'd dragged from 40 miles of estate sales. She looked at Seth. No, she said again, and smiled and meant it entirely. I've got it. She did. She absolutely, finally, completely did. And this is where our story ends for today. If you enjoyed tagging along for this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this story is worth sharing, and it lets me know to create more content like this. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next chapter, subscribe and ring that bell. I've got more stories lined up that you definitely won't want to miss. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.